Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here. I realise we're running a little bit behind time, and I'm going to try to make up time. I think I have about 20 minutes to keep us on time. But I'm going to try to make up some time. Yeah, I think that's only fair to everybody. So I've been asked to speak about child participation and a little bit about my model and how I came across it. And I thought I was talking to Michelle Sheehan, and we decided to do something a little different and maybe link it to some myths, to do a bit of myth busting around child participation. But I want to start by showing you Article 12 of the Convention, which informs most of my work and a lot of the work that is going on, I know, in the agency. I'm not going to read the whole text of it, but you can see when you have a quick flick at it, it's quite long, it's complicated, it's convoluted. And that's because it was really contentious whenever it was being drafted by the world's governments. Not everyone was completely happy with the idea that children should have their views given due weight in all matters affecting them. But it still is the most important and significant legal text that relates to child participation, and it really was the starting point for me in my work whenever I came into this field. So what I found, and this has gone back 10 years ago when I was doing work for our Children's Commissioner, we were asked to do a consultation with children across Northern Ireland on the things that they felt were maybe unfair in their lives that weren't working for them. And what we found, talking to children and talking to adults and then knowing the law, that there was a real disconnect. I knew what the law said, it was Article 12, and I knew really what people should be doing. I was talking to adults who thought they were doing it, and they would say to me, oh yes, we do this, we do the voice of the child, or we do pupil voice or student voice. So this word came up a lot, voice, we do voice. And yet when we were talking to children, it became really clear that what they were experiencing was different. It wasn't what Article 12 was meant to happen and intended to happen, and it wasn't what professionals thought was happening either. They were saying to us time and time again in every aspect of their lives that whenever they were trying to express themselves, they weren't actually being heard. Quite often, sometimes when they were expressing themselves to family or to professionals, and you can see this in one of the images that was drawn in the context of family life. So a boy talking to his mother, and the mother saying, you shouldn't be telling me what to do. And he was saying, but I was just telling you what I think. And there was this idea that when children spoke up, often they were seen to be challenging adult authority, shifting power, or being cheeky, just being cheeky, and its conversations were closing down. So I suppose I was left with this dilemma of having a knowledge of the law, a knowledge of what children were saying, and then a knowledge of what professionals were telling us they did. And I became really uncomfortable with this talk of voice, this notion of voice, the voice of the child. And this is my first myth. I suppose there was a bit of the emperor's, can you see that clearly? That's the emperor's new clothes. Can you see the little child who calls and says the emperor's actually naked? So the adults are all pretending he's wearing this suit spun of gold. But the child, of course, the voice of the child is often that honest voice that comes and sort of says exactly how it is when others are pretending it's better than it is. But for me, there was a bit of me being that child going, why are you all using this term when this term is wrong? You know, the emperor's new clothes, calling something that was a really established way of looking at it. And I wrote an article. It was just an academic article. I didn't realise it was going to have the legs that it eventually had, but it was called Voice is Not Enough. And it was a kind of sort of step back and saying, let's look at this idea of voice and saying really that each of the ways we talk about participation isn't really capturing all of it. Voice of the child, the right to be heard, the right to have a say, they're just really not good enough to describe what's meant to be happening. They capture a bit of it, but they don't capture the whole of it. And what I then did was I attempted to say, well, if it's not voice, voice is an element of it, but it's not the whole of it. And so what else would be in there? And I played around with it a while, and I decided, well, actually trying to find something that was, accessible and was accurate in terms of the law. It was, coped with Article 12, but it was understandable. And I come up with these 4 concepts, which are space, voice, audience, and influence. And I know many of you have been working to these, and I think it's fantastic. I'm really honoured that TISLA and many other agencies are using this model and finding it helpful. But for me, the most significant thing about it, and I'll come on to describe it a bit, is actually the second half of it. There was a lot of stuff going on in space and voice, but actually I suppose a bit of neglect around the idea of, well, okay, if we are encouraging children to say what they think, who's actually listening? And more important, is the person listening the person that actually has power to do something, the power to affect change? And crucially, if there is a capacity for change, is it happening? Are we responding to young people whenever they express their views? So that's the basis of the model. I think this is where I'll save time. I won't go into all the detail of this, but space, I think the crucial thing about space for me is that we don't wait for children to come to us, knock the door and say, this is what I think. We actually have to actively create spaces, and that's why I'm really excited about going to the workshops today, because it's so clear that you have been actively, and children and young people themselves have been actively creating safe, inclusive spaces where they can express their views and be heard. And that is, it takes energy and it takes effort and takes commitment. It just won't happen unless we make it happen. Voice, and I think this is something that was often missed, and I know that it gets coded a lot, is that we have to remember that this is a right. It's not a duty. Young people don't have to express themselves, and they can decide not to say anything, not to be included, not to participate. And that in itself sometimes is the expression of a view. But we have to remember that the only right that you're actually forced, the only human right that we all have, that you don't have to exercise, that you can't reject, is the right to education, believe it or not, that actually education is compulsory. Nothing else is. We can reject all our other human rights, and children are no different. So it's afforded to all children capable of forming a view. Again, this is misunderstood. In the text of Article 12, they talk about age and maturity, but that only relates to the weight that you give to the view. There is no limit on children expressing their views other than their capacity to express it. And I want to talk a little bit later about what that actually means. So all children who are capable of expressing a view have a right to be heard, irrespective of age and maturity. Audience, and again, this was a missing element, and I mentioned earlier that often we encourage children to speak, but we've got to make sure that they're getting the chance to speak to the right people, that the right people are hearing what they have to say. And I think in a rights-based framework, that is the person with power. It's often the person with resource. It's the person who can actually do something about their views. So other people might be the people who facilitate and support children, but it's really crucial that we get it to decision makers if we really want change. And we have been arguing in our centre that really there's a kind of right of audience here. We need a dedicated listener, and you need to identify that person. Who's the person whose job it is to actually listen whenever you're encouraging children to express their views. And finally, influence. And this, in the text of the convention, it says that we give children's views due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. And we know this is where it can all go belly up. I've done 10 years of work now with children and young people in consultations, often talking to them about their participation. And very frequently they say they love the experience, it's great, they've been really well supported, they've really enjoyed it, it's increased their confidence, but nothing happened, nothing changed, or they didn't see change, or they don't know if change happened because no one told them. And I suppose this is the really crucial element. This is where everyone has to do better. And it's in this element of partly, and I think this is what happened at the time when I was writing this, I had a dilemma about this fourth concept, whether I would call it response or influence. And I ended up thinking we need more than response. We actually do need influence and response. I had an interesting conversation, I don't know where he is now, with Pat Osborne about 3 years ago at the launch of the National Children's Participation Strategy, where he said to me he'd spoken and worked with young people here in the agency who'd said that there should be a fifth category of response. And I'm often very persuaded by that maybe response should have been on its own. And I'm looking at revising the model, and I think, would I put it on its own or will I not? But it's crucial, that idea of, and not just that response, which is that lovely letter that goes, thank you very much for participating. Your views are very important to us. We will take them seriously, and we'll never tell you again what happened. So I kind of have another presentation which is about the F word, and there's 4 F's in it, related to some F words that children said to me about lack of response. But it really is that responses should be full, the feedback should be full and detailed. They need to know exactly what happened. And that response can be that their views are not actually going to be put into effect. But they need the reasons why. If their views are not, their wishes are not being adhered to, they need to know why. And that's what a full and detailed response will look like. Okay, so why did this model appeal? Again, I wouldn't have had a clue 12 years ago that it was going to take off the way it did. It made sense to me. I didn't realise it would make as much sense to everybody else, and I'm really delighted and flattered that it does. I wanted to be legally sound and user-friendly. That was my intention. That's the way that the academic piece finished. But I realise now, and I've obviously presented this all over the place, and what its appeal is, because the main model of participation, and it's still a great model, is Hart's ladder of participation. Yet many of you in the room will know that. And it's a really useful way for many of us of thinking about participation. And what it does, it describes different stages of participation from, well, what he calls non-participation, which is manipulation, right through to young people leading in participatory actions. And it's a helpful way of looking at where young people participate and how, methods of participation. But I suppose I wasn't even trying to do that. I wasn't trying to describe the ways. What I wanted to do with my work was capture the rights-based qualities of participation, not levels, not forms. So these things work together. They're not alternatives. But I think part of the appeal of my model, I'm told, is that it's non-hierarchical. You know, that we're not saying that any one level of participation is better than any other level of participation. And that's what rights is about. And if I get one thing across to you today, I think this would be the thing, that actually a decision that was entirely child-led could be a breach of their rights. Oh. And a decision where, at the very end of Hart's ladder, where not tokenism obviously, but really it's just a level of consultation, that could be totally rights respecting. It depends on the child, the decision, the context, the age. You know, if there's no one right way to do it, it's always context specific. And I suppose what my model does says whatever way you're participating, you need to create safe and inclusive spaces, that you need to be sure children are facilitated to form and express views, etc. So it works across all of these levels. And the concepts I know are fluid and flexible, and actually what we find ourselves, and I know that you find that in your own work, is that children and young people get the concepts too, and they make them real for them. They can say what a safe space looks like, what voice is, and who they want to be audience, and whether there's been an influence. And that has been, I suppose, its appeal. Okay, and then we know, and I'm really flattered again, that as part of Ireland's National Children's Participation Strategy, which is the only one in Europe, and it's actually an amazing thing to have in a country, a whole countrywide commitment across all agencies to improving child participation. I worked with various members of various departments, including Aisling Gillen from here. There you are, I can find you all in the audience. And a very helpful way to telling me as an academic how to make some of this real. You know, sitting down and going, if you were to ask yourself a series of questions to find out if you were doing real child participation, what would the questions be? And we worked as a team to develop this checklist. And I know that, again, that's been used here in the agency. So when I talked to Michelle, I was thinking, well, what will I do? And I thought, well, that's the model, but there's still an awful lot of myths around about child participation. You know, things that people say about it that basically aren't true. And I thought, I'll do a little bit of myth busting just for a change. And I suppose the first thing is really, at its worst, it's described that if you give children participation and you're abandoning them to their rights, this idea that you're handing over all authority and power to them, and that actually that it's somehow dereliction of adult duty. Connected to that is this idea that you're undermining adult authority, or you're undermining parental authority, that if you let children, if you take for children's views seriously, you undermine adult authority. And as Fred said at the start, this is absolutely about power and power sharing. And one of the myths is the idea that you're handing it over. The reality of a rights-based approach to participation is it's power sharing, it's dialogue. It's not saying that power reduces, it's just shared between people. And I suppose, anybody recognise who the myth is, the picture? Anybody recognise it? It's a bit obscure because it's a Greek myth. I've got a few Irish ones. Icarus, yes, it's Icarus whose father Daedalus let him fly to the sun, with his wings put together by wax. And of course, Icarus came to a really awful, literally a downfall, and then he fell from the sky and died. And again, if that would, if you were asking what would a rights-based approach have been with Icarus and Daedalus, of course Daedalus should not have let Icarus, make the wings out of wax or feathers or try to escape Crete by flying to the sun. So really it's not about just saying, well, if Icarus happened to want to do that, Daedalus should have said, on you go. It was clearly wrong, and there was a situation that where there should have been more adult authority, and okay, you can take your views, I would like to fly to the sun, but no, you can't, because you're going to die, and that didn't happen. But a more academic take on that, I don't know if it's visible for you, is one of my personal academic heroes, Michael Freeman, and he talks about how do we decide when a child wants to do something and an adult doesn't think it's the right thing to do. There's quite a dilemma, and that happens in all contexts of life. And he says, and it's only one version of this, is the question we should ask ourselves is what sort of conduct would we wish as children to be shielded against on the assumption we want to mature into a rationally autonomous adulthood and then be capable of deciding on our own system of ends. That if you're trying to decide when a child wants something and you're going to intervene and say, no, you can't, that is a kind of a framework for thinking. Will it actually, you can actually think, with the child in the future look back, would they have wanted you to have made that decision to say, no, you can't, you shouldn't do that. And he says that basically children shouldn't be allowed to opt out of something that undermines their life choices or impairs their life interests in an irreparable way. And in some ways, that's his limit on children's autonomy, that you shouldn't do it, you shouldn't let children have their own way if it's going to do that. But otherwise, you should, that you should be working with them to enable choices that are not going to do that. And that's, so that's the first myth. It doesn't undermine adult authority, it's a sharing of decision making. The second one is adults know best, and we all know, I think, in this room that this is a myth. Okay, which myth do I have here? This is a good Irish one. Anybody recognise that one? Salmon and knowledge. So it's Finn McCool. And I don't know actually why. I can't really work it into a proper discussion, but it really is, I suppose, the idea that whenever Finn McCool did actually burn himself on the salmon and sucked his thumb, he gained all wisdom. But did all of you know that he had to suck his thumb again? Yeah, I didn't realise that till I reread it. So every time he wanted to be really wise, he had to suck his thumb. For you thumb suckers, it's quite a good thing, But anyway, I suppose what I'm trying to get across is, of course, it's not that adults are the only experts or that children are the only experts. There is different expertise, and what's crucial about child participation is getting the different expertise in the room and sharing it so that we have a more complete picture of what the situation is, and that has to involve children, otherwise we're just missing a trick. Third one, it doesn't apply where children are young and lack maturity. A bit of an ethical dilemma about using a meme, okay? But they are, my favourite baby meme, I don't know if any of those, is the one where the wee kid is, the one with the fist that you see in everything. Yeah, he's brilliant, but I couldn't get a good, appropriate one with him. So I've gone with this one. And I suppose it's this idea, which I mentioned earlier, that, we don't have to involve young children. And of course, that's not true. And it's this idea, can young children, the very young child, express views? And what we know is, even when a child can't speak, they're still expressing themselves. And I think what this series of baby memes tells us, when adults are looking for something really, really powerful to express an emotion, they're picking these babies, aren't they? Because these babies are so expressive, and that they're very convincing facial features, and we know we can read them. And the Committee on the Rights of the Child has emphasised that way before children can talk, they're communicating with us, and we have to listen to them. It would be tokenistic, and this one's interesting for me. I find in many different scenarios, people say to me, "Oh, we couldn't involve children. It would have been tokenistic." Have you heard that? Maybe you've said it, okay. And sometimes I've been quoted, which is probably would give most people, I don't know, they wouldn't like it. Is tokenism is a start, okay? Think of that, because actually, whenever you say it's tokenistic, you're saying you're not bringing children and young people into the decision. You're not bringing them into the room, And I remember back 30 years when I started my academic life, when they'd say, I was the token woman on meetings, but even being in the room is a lesson. When you're in the room, even if you're the token young woman, as I would have been in those days, and you're watching the space, you're learning the space, you're learning the dynamics, you're elbowing yourself in, so getting young people, even when it's tokenistic, I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say it would be tokenistic so they're not coming in at all. It wouldn't be right, and that I think is wrong. Get people in the space and then let's see what they can make of it. And I also think, and this was from my article, it's not really an adult decision. Child participation isn't in the gift of adults. It's not for us to decide when they come in. They should be in anything affecting them. It's a right of the child and not the gift of adults. I'll not do the minnow quote. Okay, what myth is this? Another Irish one? Maybe not a myth, sorry. Actually, probably a religious story. Anybody recognise that one? St. Bridget's cloak, okay. And this is about St. Bridget's magic cloak, and this is the idea that St. Bridget asked the king for a place to build a church, and he said you can have the physical space that your cloak covers. And she got her 4 friends to take corners of the cloak, and they started moving north, south, east and west, and the cloak just kept expanding and expanding, and the king panicked and also then, had a kind of epiphany and realised and said, right, okay, you can build your church, you can have your land. And I think there's a bit of a reaction to child participation like that. If we let them in, this idea that they're going to take over, it's going to go too far and it's not going to be meaningful. And again, that's not our choice, that actually if children come into space and take more space and keep moving out, that's a very positive thing, and that's what I'm hoping to see this afternoon. And legends. And actually I thought long and hard about this, and I didn't in the end want to go with any typical mythical legends, and I picked really one human legend. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Janusz Korczak? Anybody in the room? No? Nobody in the room has heard of him? Well, I'm really pleased to tell you about him then. He was an incredible legend, a legend of child rights, a legend of child participation, living between 1978 and 1942. He was a Polish paediatrician who ran an orphanage where he looked after children, but he looked after them where he ran this orphanage in a completely child democratic way. It had its parliament, its children's media, children made all the decisions, they had their own charter. So he was doing this in the 1910s, 1920s and 1930s. What's interesting about him is there's a book, I think the little red book in the middle is called King Mat I. Now basically, so he was a children's story writer, and this book, King Mat I, is as famous in Poland as something like Peter Pan is, for us. So he was a really famous children's author. And then he wrote a lot of books about child rearing that were about basically participatory child practices in terms of looking after children. I won't read out all his quotes, but he's well worth reading. Anything he says is just so profound and so ahead of its time. So when people tell you child participation is new and it's all, we're only getting there, he was doing this, Well, actually he was doing it 100 years ago. So he was saying things like, the child's not foolish. There are no more fools among children than adults, that speaking with children is a difficult art because of the way children communicate, but it's an art that we have to learn. What's also kind of significant about him, if you know his life story, is that, there's no easy way to put this. He ended up going to Treblinka and was gassed with his children. And he was given the choice of not going, leaving the children, and he would be saved because he was so famous, and the Germans were really worried about the implications of killing the person who'd written King Mat I. And he refused to leave them, and there's this footage of him walking along with children playing musical instruments as he went to the train to get to Treblinka, where they would all be basically exterminated. So he refused to leave them. So an incredibly powerful life story, well worth reading, but it's also, for me, you need to know that, but what's actually really significant is, again, his writing on child participation. So if I could have given you many, many quotes, but here's one. The child must be seen as a foreigner who does not speak our language, who's ignorant of laws. Occasionally she likes to go sightseeing, but when lost will ask for information and advice. What children want is a guide to answer questions politely and patiently. Treat her ignorance with respect. The child is honest. When he does not answer, he answers, for he doesn't want to lie and he cannot say the truth. To my surprise, I've stumbled on a new thought. Silence is sometimes the highest expression of honesty. So there's more and more and more of that. And he has many books all translated in English, and they're all some of the things you wouldn't agree with, but it's just that conception that a child should be able to speak for themselves. They should have autonomy in decision making, and that the adult's job is there as a guide and to help. And finally then, am I okay for time? Where am I now? What? How many minutes have I got? I've got 5? 4, perfect. That's just what I need. now. And then again, one last legend for me is, again, I mentioned him earlier, is Michael Freeman, who would be the kind of leading child rights academic. And I just want to emphasise why, again, because this is where I come from on this. It's not child participation. We know there's lots of evidence to say you get better decision making, more effective services, children build their confidence. And those are all great things, but actually none of them really matter, because from a rights perspective, they're just entitled to do it, irrespective of any of those things. They're good byproducts, but you have to see it as a right. And Michael Freeman says, like, why is it important to have rights language? Without rights, the excluded can make requests, they can beg or implore or be troublesome. They can rely on what has been called noblesse oblige, or in others being charitable or generous or kind or cooperative or even intelligently foresighted. But they can't demand, for there is no entitlement. So rights language actually matters, and it particularly matters with children who are often left without rights or not seen with rights as rights holders. And there's no doubt that in many arena, there's a resistance to rights generally, and there's a particular resistance to the idea of children as rights holders, again, because it threatens adult authority and power at times. And I've been thinking a lot about that. How do we persuade? It's not hard to persuade children, they've got rights. How do we persuade adults that don't see it that way, that want to say, I'm doing it as a matter of charity or whatever? It's not about children's entitlement. And this is my last myth. It's actually my favourite childhood myth. Okay, anybody know this one? This one's maybe a bit obscure. Aesop's tale, yeah, well done. So this is one of Aesop's fables, and it's quite an interesting story about how you get people to change. And it's a battle between the sun and the wind to see who's more powerful. And they're arguing about, and the sun saying, oh, I'm stronger than you, and the wind saying, no, I'm stronger than you. And they decide to have a competition, and they pick a man. In my childhood book, it was a man on a bench. But in the Aesop's fable, it was a man with a cloak. And they say, well, okay, the first person to get the man to take off the cloak is more powerful. Okay? And so the wind says, no problem. And the wind blows strong, blows strong, blows strong. And of course, as the wind blows, what does the man do with his cloak? He wraps it around him more tightly. So he refuses to budge because he feels he's being forced. And then what does the sun do? The sun just shines and shines and shines, and the man gets hot and he takes the cloak off. And I suppose for me that the fable is actually about, convincing people or forcing people. And what you've learned is you can't really force people into this child participation. You can attempt to. We can have laws saying you've got to actually consult with young people in this decision or that decision. But if you actually haven't convinced people about the value of it, it's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen well. And I think that's why today for me is so significant and important, because actually what we're going to see evidence of in these sessions, particularly the workshops, is all of this really convincing evidence that actually persuades other people this is worth doing and worth doing well. That's me. And then the final point to say is that as part of my work, I'm involved in an advisory group for the UNESCO Centre in the University of Galway, and I know they're evaluating the child participation element of the work of TUSLA, and I completely would encourage you to be involved with that for very selfish reasons, I have to say. I think what's going on in this agency is really pioneering and groundbreaking in child participation. I've already been sort of sending links across the world to say, here's a whole agency that's actually top to bottom and across is genuinely trying to do this. And actually, the more evidence that we have of that, the more convincing the case will be. So it's not just persuading individual adults. There's a job here for TUSLA and others for persuading other agencies just like yourself worldwide. And I'm really delighted to be here today to be part of that. Thank you.